What if the Nazis' most secret operation wasn't about weapons or battlefields, but about controlling the human mind itself? Hidden behind the chaos of the Eastern Front, Operation Zeppelin turned prisoners into tools of psychological warfare, blurring the line between loyalty and survival. The deeper you go, the more you realize this was not just a spy mission, but the birth of modern manipulation. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the campaign that began as Operation Barbarossa unleashed one of the most brutal wars in history. Within months, millions of Red Army soldiers were encircled and captured, their fate often sealed by starvation, disease, or execution in German prisoner-of-war camps. Out of this catastrophic human collapse emerged an idea that combined desperation, strategy, and manipulation to turn Soviet prisoners into tools of German intelligence. By late 1942, as the Eastern Front consumed men and resources at an unprecedented rate, the Nazi regime authorized a secret initiative to exploit the growing number of Soviet captives, an operation known as Zeppelin. Its goal was to recruit, train, and deploy Soviet POWs as agents and saboteurs behind enemy lines, transforming prisoners into instruments of espionage against their former homeland. The origins of Operation Zeppelin were rooted in Germany's shifting perception of the war's trajectory. By 1942, the rapid advances of the Wehrmacht had stalled. Soviet counteroffensives at Moscow, and later at Stalingrad, demonstrated that the conflict would not be short. German command began seeking new ways to weaken the Soviet Union from within. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence organization, and later the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, saw in the millions of Soviet prisoners both a potential threat and an opportunity. These men were demoralized, disillusioned, and desperate, conditions ideal for manipulation, ideological indoctrination, promises of food and freedom, and appeals to anti-Stalinist sentiment became the foundation of a recruitment strategy that aimed to turn captives into collaborators. The structure of Operation Zeppelin evolved from existing German intelligence frameworks. Early efforts by the Abwehr to use captured Red Army soldiers for reconnaissance had shown mixed results. Many defectors were untrained or unreliable, and few missions achieved significant success. However, in early 1942, Heinrich Himmler's SS apparatus took a greater interest in developing a coordinated program for recruiting and deploying Soviet POWs. The RSHA's Department 6, responsible for foreign intelligence, formalized these operations under the codename Zeppelin. The name was intentionally chosen for its connotations of reach and invisibility. Like the silent airships of the previous war, the operation aimed to penetrate deep into enemy territory without being detected. The political rationale for the operation was intertwined with the broader German occupation strategy. As Nazi Germany sought to control vast territories across Eastern Europe, it faced not only military resistance but also the challenge of governance and propaganda. Recruiting Soviet prisoners served multiple purposes, reducing the cost of camp maintenance, undermining Soviet morale by spreading fear of betrayal, and gathering intelligence on partisan movements and logistics. By the autumn of 1942, Operation Zeppelin had established training centers across occupied Poland and Belarus, particularly near Smolensk, Minsk, and Warsaw. In these camps, Soviet prisoners underwent intensive indoctrination and instruction in sabotage, radio operations, and infiltration techniques. The first recruits were often selected not for ideological conviction, but for survival instincts. German interrogators screened prisoners by testing their political reliability and psychological resilience. Some were former officers or engineers, others mere conscripts seeking to escape starvation. Those who accepted collaboration were promised rations, better living conditions, and, in some cases, the prospect of freedom. They were trained to memorize cover stories, to navigate Soviet terrain without arousing suspicion, and to report intelligence through hidden transmitters. Each recruit was given a new identity, a forged set of documents, and a mission: to blend into Soviet society, gather information, or carry out acts of sabotage against railways, communication lines, or factories vital to the Red Army's logistics. German intelligence officers saw in these agents the possibility of sowing chaos behind Soviet lines. However, the reality proved more complex. The RSHA faced constant internal competition with the Abwehr, whose own agents operated with different priorities. Bureaucratic rivalry often undermined coordination, while many missions were compromised from the outset. The Soviets, through the NKVD, had developed extensive counterintelligence capabilities. Captured infiltrators were interrogated, turned into double agents, or executed. Despite its ambitious scope, Operation Zeppelin quickly became a contest, not only between two enemy intelligence systems, but between illusion and control, an experiment in human loyalty under extreme conditions. By late 1942, thousands of Soviet prisoners had passed through Zeppelin training camps, though only a fraction would be deployed. German records indicate that over the course of the war, approximately 10,000 to 15,000 Soviet POWs were recruited for espionage, reconnaissance, or sabotage missions. Yet, for every successful infiltration, several ended in failure. Some agents surrendered immediately upon crossing Soviet lines, while others secretly cooperated with the NKVD, feeding misinformation back to the Germans. Operation Zeppelin became a grim microcosm of the Eastern Front itself, a war fought not only with armies but with the minds and loyalties of men trapped between two totalitarian systems. The human cost of this experiment was immense. Those who joined Zeppelin risked death on both sides, execution by their German handlers for disobedience or capture by Soviet forces as traitors. Few survived long after deployment. For the vast majority of Soviet prisoners, the offer of recruitment remained an illusion of escape that ended in tragedy. And yet, the operation continued, reflecting the desperation of a regime searching for new ways to reverse its decline. As the war moved toward its turning points at Stalingrad and Kursk, the story of Operation Zeppelin became one of both human manipulation and institutional failure, a testament to how far the machinery of total war could reach into the individual conscience. By early 1943, Operation Zeppelin entered a new and more structured phase. The program, once limited to experimental missions, now expanded under the control of the Reich Main Security Office. This shift reflected the growing importance the Nazi hierarchy placed on covert warfare as conventional military campaigns faltered. The defeat at Stalingrad had destroyed the illusion of an imminent German victory, and the Eastern Front transformed into a battle of attrition. Intelligence, deception, and psychological warfare were increasingly viewed as weapons capable of compensating for material shortages and declining morale. Zeppelin was no longer simply an auxiliary initiative. It became part of the wider German strategy to destabilize Soviet defenses from within. The organization of Operation Zeppelin was divided into several regional branches. Headquarters were established in Breslau, with operational outposts in Minsk, Warsaw, and Riga. Each zone oversaw the recruitment, training, and deployment of Soviet prisoners according to local conditions. The RSHA assigned experienced intelligence officers, many formerly of the Abwehr, to oversee operations. Among them were Walter Schellenberg, who coordinated foreign intelligence under Himmler, and SS Sturmbannführer Heinz Grafe, one of the leading figures in directing Zeppelin's field activities. Grafe emphasized discipline and control, ensuring that recruits followed strict ideological and operational guidelines. Training programs were intensive and methodical. Courses lasted from several weeks to several months, depending on the agent's intended mission. Instruction included sabotage techniques, use of explosives, map reading, survival in hostile territory, and the operation of shortwave radios. Linguistic and cultural training was particularly important. Many recruits had been away from their home regions for years, and even slight deviations in dialect could reveal their identities. German instructors also focused on psychological conditioning, teaching agents to withstand interrogation and to maintain fabricated personal histories under pressure. Those who performed poorly were often reassigned to menial labor or executed as potential security risks. To strengthen ideological motivation, the Germans experimented with political propaganda tailored to the recruits' backgrounds. Some were presented with anti-communist literature, others with nationalist rhetoric emphasizing liberation from Stalinist tyranny. Leaflets and radio programs produced by the RSHA portrayed Germany as a liberator of the peoples of the Soviet Union. This psychological manipulation aimed to transform personal despair into political commitment, though most recruits likely joined for survival rather than conviction. Reports from German officers reveal that hunger, disease, and the fear of camp death were the most effective recruiting tools. The missions themselves were varied. Some agents were tasked with infiltrating partisan networks that operated behind German lines, gathering intelligence on sabotage operations, or locating hidden Soviet supply depots. Others were dropped by parachute deep into Soviet-held territory to disrupt transportation and communication routes. Each operation was small in scale, typically involving 2 to 5 men, and relied on secrecy and local support. German aircraft, particularly the Ju-52 transport plane, were modified to conduct these covert insertions under the cover of night. Agents carried miniature radios, coded messages, and cyanide capsules to prevent capture. One of the earliest Zeppelin deployments took place near Smolensk in February 1943. A group of 5 Soviet agents trained in sabotage and reconnaissance was inserted into an area controlled by the Red Army's 10th Guards Army. Within 2 days, all were captured by the NKVD. The Soviet counterintelligence agency quickly recognized the pattern and began setting traps. The Germans, unaware that their network had been compromised, continued to send agents who were immediately detained. Many of these captured operatives were turned, forced to transmit false reports back to their handlers, creating a feedback loop of misinformation that misled German command about Soviet troop movements. Despite these setbacks, Operation Zeppelin persisted. German reports from mid-1943 show an estimated 2,500 trained agents, with around 600 actively deployed in Soviet territory. The RSHA attempted to improve reliability through a hierarchical command structure within the recruited personnel. Former Red Army officers were given authority over smaller cells to maintain discipline and ensure communication. However, these internal hierarchies often replicated the very mistrust that plagued the German intelligence system. Agents frequently denounced each other, accusing rivals of disloyalty or sabotage, which resulted in arrests and executions within Zeppelin's own ranks. The expansion of Zeppelin coincided with the growing chaos of the Eastern Front. As Soviet offensives gained momentum, supply lines were stretched and partisan resistance intensified. In this environment, Zeppelin's agents found it increasingly difficult to operate. Many missions failed before even reaching their objectives, and desertion rates rose. Some agents, realizing the futility of their assignments, surrendered immediately to Soviet authorities and provided detailed information about Zeppelin's operations, training sites, and German handlers. These confessions allowed the NKVD to map much of the organization's structure and to use its captured personnel in counterintelligence efforts. By late 1943, the operation was under pressure from all directions. Himmler demanded results to justify continued funding, while the RSHA's field divisions reported growing losses. The dream of using Soviet prisoners as an organized intelligence army was collapsing under the realities of war and human unpredictability. Yet, within the Nazi command, abandoning Zeppelin was unthinkable. The operation continued to adapt, drawing on new propaganda strategies and seeking alternative uses for its recruits. What began as a covert recruitment plan was evolving into a vast, desperate experiment in psychological and political control, a reflection of the Reich's own disintegration. By early 1944, Operation Zeppelin entered a phase of reorganization driven by necessity rather than ambition. The war had shifted decisively against Germany. The Red Army was advancing westward through Ukraine and Belarus, while the Wehrmacht struggled to maintain coherent defensive lines. For German intelligence, this change in the balance of power demanded adaptation. Zeppelin, originally conceived as an offensive espionage and sabotage program, was redefined as a desperate defensive tool. Its agents were now deployed to gather intelligence on Soviet troop movements, report partisan activity, and slow the inevitable Soviet advance through misinformation and disruption. The RSHA, recognizing the declining effectiveness of mass recruitment from POW camps, introduced new criteria for agent selection. The chaotic conditions of late 1943 had exposed the unreliability of many recruits, leading to an increased focus on individuals with specialized skills or clear anti-Soviet sentiments. Ethnic minorities from the Soviet Union, Ukrainians, Balts, Georgians, and Tatars, became a larger share of Zeppelin's personnel. Many of these groups harbored grievances against Stalin's regime, and German officers viewed them as potentially more trustworthy than Russian conscripts. Propaganda units emphasized the idea of liberation from Bolshevism, framing collaboration as participation in a pan-European crusade rather than betrayal. Training facilities relocated further west to escape the front. The main centers in Minsk and Smolensk were evacuated and re-established near Warsaw and Königsberg. Training methods also changed to prioritize mobility and secrecy. Agents were taught to operate independently, relying on minimal equipment and improvisation. Clandestine communication became essential, with an increased use of microfilm, coded radio transmissions, and drop sites. The RSHA invested resources into portable encryption systems, allowing agents to transmit intelligence without direct contact. Yet, even these technical advances could not overcome the fundamental problem. The Soviet counterintelligence network was now fully aware of Zeppelin's existence. The NKVD, through its counter-espionage branch known as SMERSH, had developed extensive infiltration capabilities. Many Zeppelin recruits captured in 1943 and 1944 were turned into double agents or used to create false networks. Soviet command began a systematic campaign of deception, feeding the Germans misleading information about troop concentrations and strategic intentions. Entire phantom divisions were reported by Zeppelin agents under Soviet control, leading German high command to misallocate forces at critical moments. This dynamic turned Zeppelin into a weapon against its own creators, illustrating the limits of ideological recruitment in a war dominated by surveillance and suspicion. Despite these failures, Himmler continued to promote Zeppelin as a valuable asset. The RSHA's internal reports exaggerated successes, citing inflated numbers of enemy casualties or partisan groups destroyed. Some of these reports described fictional operations to maintain funding and political favor. In reality, the program's logistical base was collapsing. By the summer of 1944, the retreat from Belarus and the destruction of Army Group Center eliminated most of Zeppelin's eastern infrastructure. Agents who remained behind enemy lines were abandoned without communication or support. Many attempted to surrender or assimilate into local populations, while others were captured and executed as collaborators. As the Red Army advanced into Poland, Zeppelin shifted again, from field espionage to counter-partisan warfare. Its agents were increasingly used in punitive operations against suspected Soviet sympathizers, particularly in occupied Poland and the Baltic states. These missions blurred the line between intelligence gathering and direct military repression. Some units cooperated with local police formations and SS security divisions, conducting raids on villages accused of harboring partisans. These actions reflected the moral and operational decay of the operation. What began as a campaign of intelligence had devolved into acts of desperation and reprisal. Meanwhile, the Soviet authorities used captured Zeppelin personnel to conduct extensive propaganda campaigns. Public trials and newspaper articles exposed details of German recruitment tactics, portraying them as proof of Nazi brutality and the moral weakness of those who betrayed the motherland. Prisoners who confessed to collaboration were often sentenced to death or sent to labor camps, but their testimonies served a broader purpose: to reaffirm Soviet ideological unity and stigmatize any act of disloyalty. The story of Zeppelin thus entered Soviet wartime mythology as an example of enemy corruption of the weak, reinforcing the image of unwavering Soviet resilience. In the final months of 1944, the Zeppelin network still existed on paper, but had ceased to function effectively. German intelligence officers attempted to consolidate remaining resources into smaller, specialized groups, but communications were fragmentary. Many of the program's leaders, including Heinz Graffe, were reassigned to other fronts or killed during the chaos of retreat. The operations archives, containing names of agents and mission reports, were partially destroyed to prevent capture. When Soviet forces reached former Zeppelin bases, they found abandoned training materials, forged documents, and lists of personnel, evidence of a massive but disintegrating intelligence project. By early 1945, Operation Zeppelin was little more than a bureaucratic remnant within the collapsing Nazi state. The final attempts to deploy agents into Soviet territory were made during the Vistula-Oder offensive, when several small groups were parachuted near Warsaw and Lublin. None succeeded. Within weeks, most of the network's survivors either surrendered to advancing Allied troops or vanished into the ruins of occupied Europe. The grand experiment of converting Soviet prisoners into instruments of German intelligence had ended, consumed by the very forces of mistrust, deception, and ideological extremism it once sought to control. By the beginning of 1945, Operation Zeppelin had become a shadow of its former self, yet its remnants continued to operate in scattered pockets across Eastern and Central Europe. German command, aware that the war was approaching its end, tried to reorient the operation from espionage into sabotage and psychological warfare. Instead of long-term infiltration into Soviet territory, Zeppelin's focus turned to delaying the Red Army's advance through small-scale acts of disruption. The operation's surviving agents, many of whom were stranded in collapsing front zones, were ordered to destroy bridges, railways, and communication centers. This shift marked the final transformation of Zeppelin, from a clandestine intelligence program to a collection of fragmented, improvised cells operating in isolation. The loss of centralized command crippled coordination. With RSHA headquarters under increasing bombardment and supply lines cut, communication between field units and Berlin became sporadic. By March 1945, most Zeppelin groups received their directives from local SS or Wehrmacht officers rather than the intelligence hierarchy. In many cases, orders were contradictory or obsolete by the time they arrived. Some units received instructions to continue offensive infiltration missions into Soviet-held territory, while others were tasked with fortifying defensive lines or burning evidence of earlier activities. As German forces retreated through Poland and into East Prussia, Zeppelin's personnel often merged with regular combat units, losing their operational identity entirely. Despite this disintegration, the RSHA continued to produce internal memoranda describing Zeppelin as an active and valuable asset. Himmler, increasingly detached from battlefield reality, cited the operation as evidence that Germany still possessed the means to conduct strategic intelligence warfare. These claims bore little resemblance to conditions on the ground. Reports from captured agents and post-war interrogations indicate that by February 1945, fewer than 500 trained Zeppelin operatives remained in the field, most without proper support. Their missions, though occasionally successful on a local scale, had no measurable impact on Soviet operations. In the areas recently liberated by the Red Army, Soviet counterintelligence units launched an extensive cleanup campaign to eliminate any surviving networks. SMERSH teams, supported by NKVD personnel, combed through former German positions, identifying and arresting agents who had attempted to disguise themselves as civilians or displaced persons. Many were located through radio triangulation, as the use of German-supplied transmitters made concealment nearly impossible. Soviet authorities recovered a trove of documents from Zeppelin training centers, manuals on sabotage, counterfeit identification papers, and lists of potential recruits. These findings provided the Soviet Union with a detailed understanding of how Germany had sought to exploit its prisoners, and the material was later used as evidence in war crimes investigations. For the individuals who had served under Zeppelin, the war's final months were defined by fear and uncertainty. Some operatives, realizing the hopelessness of their situation, sought to surrender to Western allies, believing they would receive more lenient treatment. Others attempted to destroy incriminating documents and escape deeper into Germany. However, the chaos of the Reich's collapse made such movements perilous. SS officers loyal to the regime often executed those suspected of desertion or collaboration with the enemy. Within this environment of paranoia, Zeppelin's agents, once tools of espionage, became expendable liabilities. When Soviet troops captured Berlin in May 1945, the remnants of Zeppelin were formally dissolved. Surviving personnel either perished during the battle or were captured and interrogated by Allied forces. Western intelligence agencies, including the U.S. Office of Strategic Services and later the early CIA, examined Zeppelin's archives in detail. While they recognized the operation's limited tactical success, they were intrigued by its methodology, the recruitment and psychological conditioning of enemy prisoners for covert action. In the early Cold War, both Western and Soviet intelligence services would adopt and refine these techniques, though under vastly different ideological banners. Post-war investigations revealed that the total number of individuals involved in Zeppelin throughout its existence may have reached 20,000, though only a fraction ever conducted field operations. Of these, perhaps a few hundred survived the war. Many were repatriated to the Soviet Union, where they faced harsh punishment. Soviet tribunals classified all participants as traitors, regardless of whether they had volunteered willingly or under duress. Those not executed were sent to Gulag labor camps, their identities erased from official records. In Germany, meanwhile, most RSHA officers associated with Zeppelin either died in combat or went into hiding. Few were ever prosecuted specifically for their role in the operation, as it was overshadowed by larger war crimes trials. For historians, Operation Zeppelin occupies a peculiar place in the history of intelligence warfare. It combined elements of psychological manipulation, coercion, and propaganda on an unprecedented scale. It reflected the Nazi regime's belief that human loyalty could be engineered through fear, ideology, and control. Yet it also demonstrated the limits of such control in the face of reality. The thousands of Soviet prisoners coerced into collaboration embodied the tragic intersection of survival and exploitation, caught between two totalitarian systems that viewed them not as individuals, but as instruments. By the summer of 1945, Zeppelin existed only in scattered documents and testimonies. What remained was not a tale of espionage triumph, but a record of desperation, a program born from the illusion that human will could be weaponized indefinitely. The war had shown that intelligence, like armies, could collapse under the weight of its own deceit. And in the ruins of the Reich, the story of Operation Zeppelin faded into the broader narrative of a world reckoning with the moral and psychological devastation of total war. The collapse of the Third Reich marked the end of Operation Zeppelin as a functioning entity. Yet the story did not end with Germany's surrender. In the immediate aftermath of the war, both the victorious Allies and the Soviet Union sought to understand, exploit, and conceal the legacy of this clandestine operation. To them, Zeppelin was not merely an episode of Nazi espionage, it was a case study in psychological warfare, propaganda, and the manipulation of human survival instincts under totalitarian control. Each power interpreted it through its own lens, the Soviets as proof of German barbarity and treason among their citizens, and the Western Allies as a possible blueprint for Cold War intelligence tactics. In the Soviet Union, the NKVD and later the Ministry of State Security, MGB, launched an enormous effort to track down every surviving Soviet citizen who had been associated with Operation Zeppelin. This process, known as filtration, was systematic and unforgiving. Returning prisoners of war were interrogated repeatedly, often for months, to determine their wartime activities. The existence of Zeppelin provided Soviet authorities with a convenient framework for suspicion. Any prisoner who had spent time in German captivity risked being accused of collaboration. Even those who had merely been approached by German recruiters faced investigation. Soviet archives indicate that between 1945 and 1950, approximately 1.8 million returning POWs underwent filtration. Thousands were charged under Article 58 of the Criminal Code for betrayal of the motherland. For actual Zeppelin operatives, the sentence was almost always execution or lifelong imprisonment in the Gulag system. The psychological trauma among these men was profound. Many had joined the operation out of starvation or coercion, not ideology. For them, survival had required submission to a system that viewed human life as expendable. Upon returning home, they were once again treated as tools of state suspicion. Few were allowed to reintegrate into Soviet society. most vanished into labor camps in Siberia or Kazakhstan, where they were forbidden to speak of their past. The Soviet government suppressed all public discussion of German intelligence operations involving Soviet citizens, portraying the Red Army as uniformly loyal and unbreakable. Only after Stalin's death in 1953 did limited amnesties begin to reduce sentences for surviving prisoners. In the West, the story of Zeppelin attracted the attention of intelligence agencies newly forming in the early Cold War environment. The U.S. Office of Strategic Services, OSS, soon reorganized as the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, both studied captured RSHA documents and interrogated surviving German intelligence officers. What fascinated them was not Zeppelin's failure, but its methods, its recruitment systems, its use of psychological pressure, and its network-based approach to infiltration. Western analysts saw in these mechanisms the foundations of modern subversion, a model for how to destabilize an enemy state from within. By 1947, both the CIA and MI6 had incorporated elements of Zeppelin's human intelligence techniques into their early Cold War strategies, particularly in Eastern Europe, where anti-communist resistance movements were active. Among the materials seized by the Allies were detailed manuals used in Zeppelin training programs. These included instructions on psychological profiling, interrogation, and the use of cultural adaptation to disguise agents within foreign societies. Such documentation influenced post-war intelligence theory, merging with the broader study of behavioral science. The notion that individuals under extreme duress could be conditioned to act against their own nations became central to both psychological operations and counterintelligence doctrines of the 1950s. While the methods were now applied in the context of ideological competition between East and West, their origins lay in the dark experiments of Zeppelin. For the German participants, post-war accountability was inconsistent. The Nuremberg trials prioritized crimes of extermination and aggressive warfare, leaving most intelligence operations, including Zeppelin, largely unexamined. Some mid-level RSHA officers involved in Zeppelin's administration were interrogated by the Allies but later released, often joining post-war German intelligence networks. In West Germany, former Zeppelin personnel occasionally resurfaced in the Gehlen organization, a CIA-sponsored intelligence service composed of ex-Wehrmacht officers. Their experience in recruiting and managing agents within the Soviet sphere made them valuable assets during the formative years of the Cold War. Ironically, the same structures once used to manipulate Soviet prisoners were repurposed to monitor the Soviet Union itself. The Soviet narrative, however, remained consistent and harsh. In state publications and propaganda films of the late 1940s, Operation Zeppelin was portrayed as a monstrous plot to corrupt Soviet heroism. Recruited agents were depicted as cowards and criminals, their existence serving as moral justification for post-war purges within the Red Army and security services. The regime's emphasis on total loyalty required the erasure of any acknowledgement that Soviet citizens could be psychologically broken by hunger, imprisonment, or despair. Thus, Zeppelin became both a real intelligence operation and a symbolic instrument in the post-war politics of memory. By the 1960s, Operation Zeppelin had faded from public awareness, overshadowed by larger narratives of the Eastern Front. Yet within classified archives, its influence persisted. Scholars granted access to declassified documents decades later discovered that Zeppelin had provided early models for infiltration tactics used during the Korean War and later in Eastern Europe. In both East and West, the lessons of Zeppelin were internalized, stripped of their Nazi origins, and reframed as psychological conditioning, behavioral compliance, or ideological reorientation. In this way, a failed wartime experiment in human manipulation quietly shaped the emerging science of modern intelligence. The moral legacy of Zeppelin remains ambiguous. It demonstrated how intelligence organizations in times of existential war could transform human suffering into strategic opportunity. For the men who participated, whether as captors, recruits, or interrogators, the operation blurred the boundaries between coercion and choice, patriotism and survival. In post-war Europe, as new ideological divisions hardened, the ghosts of Zeppelin lingered, not in the ruins of the camps or archives of the Reich, but in the enduring question of how far a state will go to control the loyalties of its own people. The early decades of the Cold War turned Operation Zeppelin from a closed historical episode into a point of reference within the clandestine struggle between East and West. While the name itself vanished from headlines, its methodology survived under new designations and institutions. Former German officers who had managed Zeppelin's recruitment and training found themselves once again in positions of influence, this time advising Western intelligence agencies on counter-Soviet operations. The Gehlen Organization, established in 1946 under U.S. supervision, absorbed dozens of ex-RSHA and Abwehr operatives. Many of them had first-hand experience in psychological manipulation, infiltration tactics, and clandestine communication, all skills that originated in the Zeppelin framework. Within a few years, the organization became the foundation for the newly formed Bundesnachrichtendienst, BND, West Germany's official intelligence service. American and British intelligence were particularly interested in the human element of Zeppelin, how fear, ideology, and coercion could shape loyalty. Reports from debriefed Zeppelin officers were circulated within early CYA psychological warfare divisions. These documents emphasized techniques such as controlled recruitment, where potential assets were identified and gradually introduced to collaboration through moral ambiguity and selective incentives. The program's failure on the Eastern Front was reinterpreted not as a sign of its impossibility, but as a problem of execution under wartime chaos. The Cold War offered what its designers lacked: time, resources, and a new ideological justification. Now, manipulation of belief and fear could be presented not as exploitation, but as defense of freedom. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Operation Zeppelin continued to serve a different function, as a rhetorical weapon in the state's propaganda and education system. Soviet historiography, particularly under Stalin and his successors, used the operation as an example of Western deceit and the moral corruption of fascism. Official textbooks described it as an imperialist experiment in the enslavement of Soviet citizens, while omitting any discussion of the conditions that had led prisoners to cooperate. The concept of Zeppelinism became a shorthand for treachery in Soviet political discourse. Soldiers, students, and workers were warned that the enemies of socialism always sought to infiltrate the state through deceit, echoing the wartime memory of German intelligence's manipulation of Soviet captives. Behind this propaganda lay a persistent fear among Soviet authorities that the same vulnerabilities Zeppelin exploited might exist within their own population. The Soviet security services, by now reorganized into the KGB, studied captured German records of the operation to improve their counterintelligence methods. Psychological resilience, ideological training, and surveillance of returned POWs became key elements in Soviet security policy. The trauma of Zeppelin shaped Soviet paranoia, reinforcing the belief that even loyalty could be manufactured or destroyed under the right conditions. The result was a system that sought to eliminate uncertainty by institutionalizing suspicion. Western analysts observing this phenomenon found a strange symmetry. The very techniques Germany had once used to undermine the Soviet Union had now become part of Soviet statecraft. In the 1950s, U.S. and NATO strategists examined reports of KGB re-education programs for defectors and noted striking similarities to Zeppelin's methods: the same emphasis on confession, self-reconstruction, and ideological persuasion. It seemed that both blocs had drawn the same conclusion from the operation's history, that human conviction could be engineered. The battlefield of espionage had moved inward, from territory to the mind. By the 1960s, traces of Zeppelin appeared indirectly in psychological research, sponsored by both military and intelligence institutions. In the United States, programs such as MKULTRA explored how stress, isolation, and suggestion could influence human behavior. Although separated by time and ideology, the logic was familiar, that under controlled conditions, individuals could be reshaped into obedient instruments of policy. In the Soviet Union, parallel studies on psychological conditioning and moral rehabilitation were conducted within secret research institutes tied to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Both sides were chasing a modernized version of Zeppelin's elusive goal: mastery over belief and identity. Academically, the first Western historians to study Operation Zeppelin did not appear until the 1970s. By then, fragments of RSHA files had been declassified in West Germany and the United States. Scholars began to reconstruct the operation from partial archives and interrogation transcripts. The emerging picture was more complex than wartime propaganda had suggested. Rather than a singular, coordinated project, Zeppelin was revealed as a patchwork of overlapping agencies: the RSHA, the Abwehr, and regional SS commands, often competing for authority. The myth of a vast, efficient intelligence network collapsed under the evidence of disorganization, mistrust, and improvisation. What remained was a chilling insight into how bureaucracy could transform ideology into a mechanism of coercion. For the survivors, the rediscovery of Zeppelin in academic literature was both vindication and condemnation. A few former agents, long released from Soviet imprisonment, began to speak anonymously to journalists and historians. Their testimonies described not betrayal, but desperation, a moral landscape where hunger and death left no room for ideology. These accounts challenged the binary narratives of loyalty versus treason that had defined post-war memory. They forced historians to confront a more uncomfortable truth: that collaboration in total war often emerged not from conviction, but from the annihilation of choice itself. Thus, by the time the Cold War reached its midpoint, Operation Zeppelin had evolved into a historical mirror reflecting the moral ambiguities of both sides. It revealed how modern states, regardless of ideology, were willing to explore the boundaries of control over the human spirit. From the ruins of the Eastern Front to the laboratories of psychological warfare, Zeppelin's ghost persisted, not as a triumph or a failure, but as a warning about the power and peril of turning the human mind into an instrument of war. As détente reshaped the political climate of the 1970s and 1980s, Operation Zeppelin gradually transitioned from a classified intelligence subject into an object of historical inquiry. Yet the more scholars uncovered about the operation, the less it resembled the efficient espionage machine once imagined by both Nazi propagandists and Cold War intelligence analysts. Instead, it emerged as a portrait of disarray, a structure built on exploitation, sustained by desperation, and undone by its own contradictions. The operation's rediscovery during this period coincided with a broader reassessment of World War II intelligence work, as declassification and archival exchanges between East and West provided access to long-hidden documents. Through these, historians began to piece together the human dimension of Zeppelin, not as an abstract wartime apparatus, but as a tragedy of manipulation and survival. In West Germany, post-war historians and journalists revisited Zeppelin as part of the larger reckoning with the Nazi regime's crimes. Files preserved in the Bundesarchiv revealed that the operation had been even more extensive than previously assumed, encompassing at least 40 training centers and over a dozen major command posts across occupied Europe. Recruitment lists contain names of individuals from virtually every Soviet republic. The majority were not volunteers, but prisoners selected from overcrowded camps, often given a choice between starvation and service. The scale of this coercion underscored that Zeppelin was less an intelligence operation and more a continuation of the Reich's machinery of forced labor, an extension of the same system of dehumanization applied to millions across occupied territories. Academic focus soon turned toward the ideological mechanisms that sustained Zeppelin. Historians studying RSHA internal communications discovered that the operation's leadership genuinely believed in the possibility of reforming Soviet citizens into loyal instruments of the Reich. Training manuals referred to reconversion through discipline and reconstruction of moral awareness, echoing the language of indoctrination used within the SS itself. The documents revealed a grim symmetry between the way the Nazi state treated its own subjects and the way it attempted to reshape its enemies. Both were subjected to systems of total control, the German citizen through propaganda and surveillance, the Soviet prisoner through hunger and psychological coercion. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the official portrayal of Operation Zeppelin remained rigidly propagandistic. Archival access was tightly restricted, and the story continued to serve ideological purposes. Soviet documentaries produced during the Brezhnev era depicted Zeppelin as a failed experiment in fascist subversion, emphasizing the vigilance of Soviet counterintelligence and the moral purity of the Red Army. However, a few dissident historians, particularly those connected to the samizdat intellectual movement, began questioning this narrative. Using fragments of testimonies from rehabilitated prisoners and survivors of the Gulag, they painted a darker picture, one in which Zeppelin represented both external invasion and internal repression. Their writings suggested that the real legacy of the operation was not its espionage, but the post-war paranoia it legitimized, a state's lasting fear of its own citizens. In the West, the declassification of CIA and MI6 files in the 1980s further illuminated how Zeppelin's methods influenced early Cold War intelligence theory. Analysts studying psychological operations during that time noted direct parallels between Nazi-era training manuals and later Western counterinsurgency doctrines. Concepts such as controlled defection, cultural adaptation, and re-education under confinement appeared almost verbatim in both contexts. Yet historians were quick to note an important distinction. While Zeppelin aimed to destroy an enemy from within, Cold War psychological programs sought to prevent ideological infiltration. Both, however, relied on the same assumption, that identity and loyalty were malleable under pressure. As interest in intelligence history grew, a new generation of researchers began approaching Zeppelin not merely as a wartime anomaly, but as a case study in the evolution of modern state control. Political theorists compared it to later systems of psychological coercion, from Soviet re-education camps to Western interrogation programs during colonial conflicts. They argued that Zeppelin represented a critical junction where totalitarian ideology intersected with pragmatic intelligence strategy. It showed how the language of science and efficiency could be used to rationalize moral collapse. In this sense, the operation was not an aberration of Nazi extremism, but a prototype for post-war practices that continued to shape intelligence and law enforcement around the world. The human testimonies uncovered during this period gave Zeppelin's history its final layer of complexity. Former agents and prisoners, long silent, began to publish memoirs and interviews. Their accounts described a world where choice had disintegrated entirely, where survival depended on navigating overlapping systems of violence and deceit. Some recalled being transferred from POW camps to Zeppelin training centers, only to find themselves trapped between execution by the Germans for failure and execution by the Soviets for betrayal. A few spoke of rare moments of agency, small acts of sabotage, disobedience, or escape. Others admitted to missions carried out in terror and confusion, guided by the faint hope of living one more day. By the late 1980s, Operation Zeppelin had come to symbolize a broader moral question, not about espionage or loyalty, but about the human condition under total war. It demonstrated how, in the collision of ideologies, individuals could be stripped of all meaning except that which their captors assigned them. The operation's rediscovery during an era of renewed transparency served as a reminder that the past could not be sealed away under ideology or classification. In the end, Zeppelin stood not as an example of strategic ingenuity, but as an indictment of the belief that intelligence could be divorced from ethics. As the Cold War itself approached its twilight, the story of Operation Zeppelin quietly resurfaced to challenge the assumption that modernity had moved beyond the moral darkness of the 1940s. The collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the 20th century opened a new chapter in the study of Operation Zeppelin. For the first time, Russian archives became accessible, at least partially, to Western researchers. What emerged from the declassified documents was a far more nuanced and disturbing account than either side had previously admitted. Files from the NKVD and SMERSH revealed how deeply the operation had penetrated Soviet territory, and how paranoid the state's response had become in return. Operation Zeppelin was no longer simply a story of Nazi espionage. It was now seen as one of the earliest large-scale examples of psychological warfare, one that blurred the lines between ideology, survival, and manipulation. Researchers discovered detailed interrogation records of captured Zeppelin agents. These transcripts showed that many had been recruited under extreme duress, starvation, torture, or the illusion of freedom. Some agents had been sent back into Soviet lines only to surrender intentionally, hoping that capture would save their lives. For others, the missions were suicidal, serving only as distractions for larger German operations. Soviet interrogators meticulously documented each confession, not only to root out collaborators, but to build a case for internal purges. What began as counterintelligence soon turned into mass repression, with thousands accused of sympathizing with the enemy based on the faintest suspicion of involvement. Western historians studying these materials began to reframe Zeppelin as part of a broader phenomenon, the weaponization of psychology in total war. They noted that both Nazi and Soviet systems viewed the human mind as territory to be conquered. The Germans sought to fracture identity through coercion and indoctrination, while the Soviets aimed to erase all doubt through fear and loyalty. Zeppelin, in this sense, was a battleground of belief, a place where individuals were forced to redefine who they were to survive. This interpretation gave the operation a new dimension. It became a lens through which to understand how totalitarian regimes reshape human morality under pressure. During the 1990s, documentaries and academic conferences began addressing Zeppelin as a forgotten aspect of the Eastern Front. Journalists traced the remnants of the operation's sites in Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus. Abandoned barracks, interrogation centers, and airfields once used for inserting agents behind Soviet lines were rediscovered, often repurposed during the Cold War by local militaries. In several cases, villagers still remembered the presence of strange German units during the occupation, men who spoke Russian fluently but were distrusted even by the Wehrmacht. These oral testimonies revealed that Zeppelin's agents were sometimes used for reconnaissance, at other times for spreading misinformation or staging sabotage to justify reprisals against civilians. The boundary between intelligence and terror was thin and often non-existent. In Germany, a new generation of historians approached Zeppelin through the lens of bureaucratic complicity. They emphasized how easily ordinary administrative systems, personnel offices, medical units, transport services, had been drawn into the apparatus of coercion. Recruiting prisoners for intelligence work required coordination between SS departments, military logistics, and concentration camp administrations. Every signature on a transfer form represented a small act of participation in a vast machine that devalued human life. This bureaucratic banality, as later scholars called it, explained how Zeppelin could exist at such a scale without evoking widespread resistance among its own staff. It was not driven by fanatical belief, but by professional obedience. At the same time, post-Soviet Russian historians began reassessing their own state's role in perpetuating the myth of Zeppelin after 1945. They admitted that Soviet propaganda had deliberately exaggerated the operation's scale to justify political repression. Tens of thousands of returning POWs had been accused of Zeppelin collaboration despite having no connection to the program. The real number of active agents, archival evidence suggested, was closer to 10,000. Yet the fear of infiltration had served a crucial political purpose. It reinforced Stalin's narrative that enemies surrounded the Soviet Union both externally and within. Thus, Zeppelin's psychological effect outlasted its operational existence, shaping Soviet society long after the war ended. The ethical debates surrounding Zeppelin's rediscovery reignited interest in the moral dimension of intelligence work. Scholars began drawing parallels between wartime recruitment of prisoners and modern debates about the use of coercion in interrogation or surveillance. Could a state claim moral superiority while using fear to extract obedience? Was the manipulation of loyalty inherently immoral or simply another weapon of war? These questions made Zeppelin relevant again, not as a relic of the past, but as a reflection of enduring dilemmas in security policy. By the early 2000s, Operation Zeppelin had become a staple subject in European military archives and university courses on intelligence history, Yet, despite the wealth of data, the operation remained elusive in one crucial respect. Its human cost could never be fully quantified. Many of those who perished in Zeppelin's orbit, prisoners, handlers, civilians, left no record behind. The documents preserved were written by their captors or interrogators, not by the victims themselves. Thus, every historical reconstruction carried an element of silence, a void where individual voices had been erased. This realization transformed Zeppelin from a purely academic topic into a moral inquiry, a reminder of how easily ideology, bureaucracy, and fear can combine to turn human beings into instruments of power. By the time the last classified Soviet files were opened to researchers in the 2010s, Operation Zeppelin had taken on the character of a historical cautionary tale. It stood as evidence of how intelligence ambitions can metastasize into systems of dehumanization. Its story was no longer about spies or battles, but about the fragile boundary between necessity and cruelty, loyalty and survival. And in that space, between propaganda and truth, between coercion and consent, lay the enduring legacy of the operation that tried to weaponize the human soul. By the 2010s, the scattered remnants of Operation Zeppelin had evolved from a wartime footnote into a complex, transnational research subject. Historians, political scientists, and psychologists alike began treating it not just as an intelligence experiment, but as a moral archetype, a prism through which the 20th century's obsession with control could be examined. Conferences in Berlin, Moscow, and Warsaw brought together scholars from former Axis and Soviet states to discuss what Zeppelin revealed about the human condition under total war. Each brought their own archives, their own ghosts. What emerged was a consensus that transcended ideology. Operation Zeppelin had been not merely an espionage project, but an attempt to redefine the limits of human obedience. Newly uncovered documents from the RSHA, Reich Main Security Office, deepen this conclusion. Internal reports written by Zeppelin's directors, particularly SS Obersturmbannführer Kurt Seitzler and his subordinates, showed how the operation had grown far beyond its original intelligence scope. By 1944, it had become a semi-autonomous entity within the Nazi state, commanding thousands of coerced agents, prison laborers, and auxiliary units. Its purpose had shifted from gathering intelligence to conducting psychological warfare, spreading false information, destabilizing Soviet morale, and fostering paranoia among partisan movements. Zeppelin's handlers were instructed to break faith in Soviet command structures by planting agents who appeared loyal but acted to erode trust. The Reich no longer sought only information. It sought to weaponize confusion itself. These findings aligned with testimonies from Soviet archives that detailed how NKVD and later SMERSH officers responded. Their counterintelligence operations mirrored Zeppelin's tactics, creating an atmosphere of mutual deception that consumed entire regions. Civilians in occupied territories were caught between two invisible wars, one of ideology, another of suspicion. Villages in Belarus and Ukraine reported ghost arrests, where locals vanished on accusations of collaboration. In truth, many were victims of bureaucratic panic, products of the same logic that had birthed Zeppelin, the conviction that loyalty could be measured, that trust could be engineered or destroyed. Western intelligence historians examining declassified CIA and MI6 archives noticed an unsettling continuity. After the war, many of Zeppelin's former specialists were quietly absorbed into new institutions. Their expertise in infiltration and psychological conditioning was repurposed for Cold War aims. Training manuals from the early 1950s cited techniques strikingly similar to Zeppelin's: staged defections, identity reconstruction, and manipulation through deprivation. The goal was no longer to recruit prisoners of war, but to influence populations at a distance, through propaganda, broadcasts, and psychological pressure. In this way, Zeppelin's spirit lived on, diffused into the fabric of modern intelligence. The ethical implications of this continuity sparked fierce debate. Could democracies inherit the tools of totalitarianism without absorbing their logic? researchers argued that Zeppelin represented the genesis of what philosopher Michel Foucault would later describe as biopower, the management of life through surveillance, discipline, and control. The operation's attempt to reprogram captives through hunger and ideology prefigured later efforts to manipulate societies through information and fear. In this interpretation, Zeppelin was less a historical anomaly than a precursor to the psychological infrastructure of the modern world. Meanwhile, forensic investigations in Eastern Europe sought to document the physical remnants of Zeppelin's network. Archaeologists excavated sites in Poland, Latvia, and western Ukraine, uncovering mass graves near former SS compounds. Personal items, dog tags, camp tokens, fragments of uniforms, testified to the hybrid nature of the operation, part concentration camp, part intelligence base. One discovery near Łódź revealed an underground bunker with communication equipment still intact, its walls etched with prisoner markings in Cyrillic. Among them were names and dates corresponding to missing Soviet POWs, confirming that many had perished in Zeppelin's service or shortly after its dissolution. For descendants of the victims, these revelations reignited painful questions of memory and accountability. In Russia, official recognition remained limited. State narratives continued to emphasize Nazi cruelty, while omitting the internal purges that had mirrored it. In Germany, memorials to Zeppelin's victims appeared quietly, often funded by independent historians or local initiatives. A plaque in Dresden commemorated the unknown agents coerced into betrayal, while in Minsk, a museum exhibit contrasted Zeppelin's methods with Soviet countermeasures, presenting them as two sides of a single totalitarian coin. Scholars increasingly describe Zeppelin as a negative laboratory, a place where the psychological boundaries of obedience were tested under the most extreme conditions. It demonstrated that ideology alone was insufficient to command loyalty. What truly compelled action was fear, isolation, and the destruction of moral reference. This insight reverberated beyond historical studies, influencing modern discussions of radicalization, interrogation ethics, and state surveillance. Political theorists saw in Zeppelin the prototype of a world where government sought not only to command behavior, but to manufacture belief. Yet, for all the research, much of Operation Zeppelin's inner world remained irretrievable. Thousands of documents were destroyed during Germany's retreat, and many Soviet records remained classified or redacted. The surviving materials revealed more about the machinery of control than about the individuals trapped within it. Historians compared Zeppelin to a black hole in the moral history of war, an event whose existence could be measured by its effects, but never fully observed. It had left behind no victory, no ideology, and no heroes. Only the enduring question of how easily modern civilization could turn human minds into extensions of policy. As the 21st century unfolded, Operation Zeppelin became a symbol not of espionage, but of warning. Its methods anticipated the psychological dimensions of information warfare, the manipulation of truth in mass media, and the global systems of control that define contemporary power. In that sense, Zeppelin did not end with the fall of the Reich or the collapse of the Soviet Union. It survived quietly in the logic of every state that seeks to manage thought, to shape loyalty, to transform belief into obedience. Its history stands as a mirror to our own, reflecting how, even in the pursuit of security, humanity risks recreating the very structures of domination it once sought to defeat. In the years that followed, Operation Zeppelin faded from immediate memory, overshadowed by the larger narratives of the Second World War. Yet its legacy lingered in the shadows of both scholarship and statecraft, an uneasy reminder of how easily intelligence could become an instrument of dehumanization. As the Cold War receded and the archives of the major powers gradually opened, Zeppelin re-emerged as a historical puzzle that refused simple classification. It was not a military campaign, nor a conventional spy network, nor merely a crime of ideology. It was something broader, an experiment in control, a rehearsal for the age of psychological warfare that would define the modern world. The post-2000 generation of historians treated Zeppelin not only as a historical episode, but as a warning encoded in bureaucratic form, The program had operated through offices, reports, and clerical signatures, the ordinary instruments of governance, rather than through visible atrocities. This realization transformed its interpretation. It showed that totalitarian power did not always rely on overt violence. It could operate through the quiet rationality of paperwork, through the language of necessity and efficiency. Zeppelin's administrators never saw themselves as executioners. They saw themselves as managers of information, solving logistical problems in the name of security. That illusion of neutrality, of just following procedure, became one of the central themes in later analyses of the operation. In the 2010s, academic collaborations between German and Russian historians deepened the story further. Joint publications compared Nazi recruitment files with NKVD counterintelligence records, revealing how closely the two systems mirrored each other. Both sought to redefine loyalty as a technical variable rather than a moral one. Both measured faith through performance, surveillance, and confession. In this convergence, researchers saw the blueprint of the modern security state, a structure in which ideology mattered less than the maintenance of control. Zeppelin, once viewed as a uniquely Nazi aberration, now appeared as part of a continuum that stretched across the 20th century, connecting fascist, communist, and later democratic systems through shared mechanisms of psychological management. New technologies also brought new ways of remembering. Digital archives and interactive exhibitions allowed the public to trace Zeppelin's geography, from the recruiting barracks in occupied Poland to the interrogation cells of Smolensk and the false flag missions launched across the Eastern Front. Survivors' voices, preserved through oral history projects, introduced an emotional dimension long absent from official documents. Their testimonies revealed that even within the machinery of coercion, fragments of humanity persisted. Some prisoners sabotaged missions, others misled their German handlers, and a few used their positions to warn Soviet civilians of impending reprisals. These small acts of defiance did not alter the outcome of the war, but they challenged the myth that moral choice disappears entirely under totalitarianism. At the same time, the study of Zeppelin began influencing discussions in ethics, law, and security policy. Military academies in Europe and North America cited it as a historical case study in the dangers of instrumentalizing people under coercion. Intelligence agencies quietly incorporated its lessons into training on human rights compliance. The paradox was evident. The very institutions that once benefited from Zeppelin's methods now studied it as a cautionary tale. It symbolized the thin line between necessity and abuse, a line that every modern state, regardless of ideology, must constantly redraw. Philosophers and sociologists found in Zeppelin a metaphor for the 21st century's information systems. Just as the operation sought to reshape prisoners' minds through propaganda and isolation, contemporary societies confronted subtler forms of influence through media, data, and surveillance. The difference lay in scale, not in kind. In lectures and publications, scholars drew unsettling parallels between Zeppelin's psychological conditioning and the algorithms that now guided political discourse. Both operated by eroding autonomy, by replacing understanding with reaction. The study of the past thus became a mirror of the present, an invitation to question whether humanity had truly learned from its earlier descent into managed obedience. By the 2020s, public recognition of Zeppelin's victims began to grow. Memorials appeared across Eastern Europe, funded by local historians and civic groups rather than governments. In Minsk, an annual conference brought together descendants of both agents and interrogators, exploring how inherited guilt and silence shape family memory. In Germany, school programs included Zeppelin within the broader curriculum on Nazi crimes, emphasizing its psychological dimension rather than its operational details. The effort was not to assign blame, but to illuminate how systems of control depend on the complicity of ordinary people. The story of Zeppelin became a lesson in responsibility, not of nations, but of individuals within them. Still, many questions remained unresolved. The full number of Zeppelin operatives will never be known. Most records were destroyed, and many participants erased themselves from history through anonymity or death. The precise extent of Soviet retaliation remains equally obscure, hidden in the sealed files of post-war tribunals. This absence of closure gave the operation an enduring, almost spectral presence. Like the airships whose name it borrowed, Zeppelin hovered over the landscape of memory, vast, silent, and faintly luminous, a structure built from the belief that control could replace trust. Today, historians describe Operation Zeppelin as one of the clearest examples of how ideology, bureaucracy, and fear can merge into a single engine of manipulation. It stands as evidence that intelligence, when stripped of ethics, ceases to serve knowledge and begins to serve domination. Its lessons extend beyond its time, that no state, however justified its cause, can preserve its humanity if it treats people as instruments, that the pursuit of absolute security inevitably reproduces the violence it seeks to prevent. In the end, the story of Operation Zeppelin is not about victory or defeat. It is about the fragility of conscience under pressure, about the ease with which ordinary systems can become extraordinary horrors. Its archives may be nearly closed, its witnesses gone, but its warning endures, whispered through history like the echo of its name, that every generation must choose whether to remember control or to understand freedom.